Welcome to the 443rd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome my friend RUSS PHARR to discuss living through pandemic days in Texas. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls live broadcasts on Twitter. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. As always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest, but don't wait too long. We're ending the regular COVID Calls broadcasts on March 16th. As of March 2nd, 2022, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, 85,050 people have died from COVID-19 in the state of Texas. 32,951 have died in New Jersey. 85,557 people have died from COVID-19 in California. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic. I'd like to continue that reading now. Headline: Beloved North Texas builder dies of COVID-19. This was written by Maria Guerrero and published December 20th, 2021 in the NBC DFW affiliate website. A beloved North Texas builder with high-profile construction projects under his belt, including AT&T Stadium and Globe Life Field, has died of COVID-19. The new home of the Texas Rangers, dubbed Foreman Supervisor Abel Gallegos the heart of the ballpark, Gallegos left his mark on his family and Texas. He loved this country because of everything it has to offer, said his son, Jaime Gallegos. His father immigrated to North Texas from Mexico in the 1970s. Gallegos later became a U.S. citizen and rose in the ranks of the construction industry in North Texas. He became a foreman supervisor in several high-profile building projects, from Kyle Field to the American Airlines Center and Globe Life Field, which hailed project leads, including Gallegos, as the heart of the ballpark. Gallegos had a hand in building his pride and joy AT&T Stadium, where a brick bears his name. He has the shovel that broke ground, just so many things that he accomplished from that stadium, and he continued talking about it. It was his pride and joy, his son said. 64-year-old contracted COVID-19 in mid-November 2021, according to his family. He initially was reluctant to get tested, thinking it was the flu. Gallegos' condition worsened and he was hospitalized for 2 weeks. Gallegos was not vaccinated, but had been keeping the virus at bay by wearing a mask and using hand sanitizer wherever he went, according to his son. One of the things he said, he couldn't believe it was him. It was because of his carelessness. He let his guard down, his son said. It's going to be a rough Christmas not having him here. He was our brick and mortar. Jim Cudahy of Manhattan Construction spoke with NBC5 about Gallegos, calling him a great man, very humble, cared very deeply about his family. Right behind that, Abel was the best builder I've ever been around in my career. The industry veteran was known for his dedication to his work and crew members, as well as his can-do attitude. There was nothing Abel wasn't able to figure out, said Cudahy. No matter what you brought to Abel, he'd figure out a way to get it done and get it done in a very high quality level. Life of Abel Gallegos, who died in December 2021 of COVID-19. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today. I've really been looking forward to this one. Let me introduce my guest, Russell Pharr. Russ Pharr is a graduate of Austin College in Sherman, Texas. He is the father of two fantastic teenagers, and he currently works with Rivian Automotive, the electric vehicle maker that brought the first all-electric pickup truck to market. He is a native Texan, grew up in Arlington, Texas, and he currently lives in Dallas, Texas. Russ Pharr, welcome to COVID Calls.
Hey, Scott. How are you, man? Good to see you, brother.
Thanks for making time for the call.
Absolutely. We've been trying to
So
do this for a little while.
I know we've talked about talking on COVID calls longer than we're going to talk on COVID calls, but that's for the making of. We'll do that another time. Let me start the way I usually do, just find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic looks like.
So I am in Dallas, Texas. I live in a neighborhood a couple of miles, not even a couple of miles, about a mile east of downtown called Old East Dallas. Um, I guess good news on our end. Uh, After having some of the highest rates in the country for the last 2 years, rates are coming down, both deaths and infection. We're starting to get in Dallas to where we can relax mask mandates based off of the actual numbers being down and not because our state government decides that they need to tell our local governments what to do, which they're pretty big fans of telling us when the federal government wants to get involved in Texas politics, but they're real big on central government when it comes down to things that they believe in. But I won't go down too deep down that rabbit hole, but we'll put that there. Um, so yeah, good news that rates are coming down. Picked up my son from school today. DISD relaxed their mask mandate, making them voluntary and optional beginning of this week, I believe. It might have been Thursday or Friday of last week. And my son, some background, my son's on the spectrum. He's high functioning. He's awesome. And, but he gets some pretty big bouts of anxiety, especially over the last 2 years, over everything that's been going on here in Texas. And I asked him how he was feeling now that it wasn't required for him to not wear a mask. And he said, I'm really happy about it. I really get to see, essentially I get to see people's faces and it makes me more comfortable. And that's been actually a bit of a shift for him over the last 6 months or so for him to get comfortable with that. Which it's, on my end, good news to see. And locally in Texas here, the numbers, especially on paper, are horrific. I think Dr. Peter Hotez said something, I think back in December, maybe November, that essentially since the beginning of the pandemic, 200 people in Texas have died every day since the beginning of the pandemic, which when we put it in those terms, it's unimaginable. You can't imagine what that looks like, except that, one of the things that, has really struck me about COVID is you don't see it. I've been extremely fortunate. I've had COVID. Um, I've had people in my family get COVID. Everything was mild. By general terms, no hospitalizations. I haven't had anyone close to me pass away from COVID. Um, and to a certain extent, Texas is a very large state. It's very spread out. It's, other big news item right now, it's bigger than Ukraine. It's a big place, and there's lots of empty space, and there's lots of places where COVID didn't even really touch, if you can believe it. I mean, it was there, but when you look at the big nature of it, it was like if you weren't in a big city or an urban population, if you were somewhere, out in the Davis Mountains,
Yeah.
it's easy to see how somebody could think it was a rumor, if that makes any kind of sense, if you don't really know what's going on and you don't have it touch you.
Yeah,
But
I'm,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I'm glad you said that because it's, I was doing a little research before the call and, I have some hangups about the numbers, but we use
Yeah,
them as a way to talk about the pandemic
right.
and 85,050 deaths, almost exactly the same number as California.
Yep.
And one thing, what you said there is important because the national numbers in a country as diverse as the United States, geographically, economically, racially, I don't think they tell us a very good. I don't think they tell us a very interesting story or important story. If you dive into the state, you could say, okay, this is better. Like if you talk about New Jersey, but with Texas, the size of a nation, you have to go deeper than that even. And if you look at the sort of death rate by population, Texas is around the middle. It's not even
Hmm.
close. Almost all of the worst states are southern by death rate are southern states that did not follow closely or any sort of healthcare precautions in the various waves of the pandemic. Texas is in the middle, but I think if you dive deeper in those numbers and look at urban areas, you'll see a different story there.
Yeah, and I think that's where, for me, the kind of politicalization of the numbers and masks and vaccines and all of that, it's like, I get if you live somewhere that doesn't have any people in it. I mean, that sounds really, really bad. I understand that from a certain perspective, right? But I also understand that why would you want certain mandates put on you when there is no impact in your area? But because we politicized it, now where there are impacts, real impacts in Dallas, in Bexar County, in Harris County,
Right.
in Travis County, we now have to hamstring ourselves because of that, and we have to dictate from above what needs to be happening in our localities as opposed to what's going on, right? And I also have found it interesting that, like you mentioned in the numbers, California, who had, without without too much debate, some of the most draconian lockdowns of all 50 states, and is also the most populous state that we have, and Texas is the second most populous state, and our numbers were the kind of the same, and you're like, it makes you wonder if we're, through centralizing that control, if we're not actually helping the problem to a certain extent. um all that being said, that's not like a ringing endorsement of either thing. I don't think it was. I don't think it is. I don't think, but I think it's like you say, you've got to dive deeper into those numbers than you can. Um, then the numbers don't tell an interesting story. You know why? Because they're numbers. they're not people. I mean, and as good and everything as the numbers are coming down, I got a text today that, on a group thread from some friends of mine, of a gentleman I don't even know, who passed away last night from COVID-19. And, you know, it's, you still look at those and you're like, well, how, could that have been avoided? How do we do
Yeah.
this? Um, how do we protect all the people all the time, but without, uh, I, I don't like using like that personal freedom thing, because I don't think it isn't. I mean, we don't have this discussion about secondhand smoke,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah.
for some reason, this gets politicized.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, just to quickly tie that part up, I mean, if they look at the death rates by population, California is substantially less than Texas. So but I think it's as you're
Yeah.
saying,
Okay.
it's really, in a state like Texas, and I think that's what I want to ask you about next, is sort of your experience there of the politics of this, the politicization of this
Hmm.
in a state as wildly diverse as Texas is in every way you can
Yeah.
imagine. Um, you have a situation. Well, let me throw this out there and see what you think. You have a
Sure.
situation where people who either don't perceive COVID risk to have been that important, or maybe it actually was less important because they live in rural areas and the population density is lower, particularly earlier in the pandemic,
Early,
before
yes.
vaccination, that they sort of crafted an ideological response, and then that drove that necessarily created the friction in places where Dallas, like Dallas or Houston or San Antonio, that should have been governed exactly the way you would govern Boston or Chicago or New York City.
Right. Yeah, I think that that does drive it to a certain extent in the fact that there's a I mean, we're having I'm sure you realize this as well. You know, we're having this discussion on Texas Independence Day. So, uh, which Scott, for those of you who don't know, Scott and I went to high school together. We were raised in the Texas public school system. In seventh grade, we get handed a book that is twice the size of our American history book that is called Texas History. And we're one of the few states that do this. And it's the history of Texas from Paleolithic times until now, which is my wife was from out of state and she thinks that this is crazy when she became a
I
public school teacher here.
I always ask people if they have those classes, and some states do. I think Ohio does, and maybe even New
Hmm.
Jersey does. But the Texas one, as you point out, the book is a tome.
Oh yeah, it's
And
fantastic.
but I'll defy you to find a chapter on slavery.
Yeah, no, it you know, as you know, it's a fairly big discussion right now around here. So,
Yeah, sure.
um, and but yeah, I think it does define that, and I think you know, somewhat of the Texas mythos ends up driving a lot of these discussions, just like the American myth drives a lot of these discussions as well, where
Hmm.
we're fiercely independent. And what always has fascinated me about that argument is oh, we're fiercely independent. And it's like, no, we're not. The foundations of our state are community driven. They're driven by the fact that we had to rely on each other in these small communities to build the state that we've built this myth around. And it's not true. And I think, you know, Texas to a certain extent and the national discussion here gets defined by its politics. And although here the last year or so, it has been defined by its politics and the battles across um, both COVID guidelines and numerous other political topics. Um, you know, that, but Texas isn't that. It's almost like that whole idea of us when we were growing up, it was like, you know, Texas politics isn't something that you take seriously. We take seriously things that deserve seriousness, like high school football.
Yeah.
And right, and you know, I had a political science teacher my freshman year in college, you know, tell me that we're supposed to dedicate 3 weeks of political science 101 to the study of Texas government. And he said, but I choose to use my political science time to discuss developed forms of government. And we're going to spend the next 2 days on it.
And I mean that's really, I'm so glad you brought these issues up, because this is the level that often gets missed. Again, if you just sort of look at table of statistics across states. I mean, I remember pretty early in the pandemic, my father, who's been a guest on COVID calls and has been fastidious about COVID and has done everything and then some to protect himself and his family. But one of the earliest things that he wanted to talk to me about was college football season and whether or not the
Right.
Longhorns were going to play in the fall, because there was this idea maybe they wouldn't even play
Right.
in the fall of 2020, or were they going to play in an empty stadium? And if you've been to that stadium, I mean, that's kind of a crazy idea. What was
Yeah.
that going to look like? It was kind of a fascination of his, and I thought he was sort of joking at first, but over that summer, I realized like, no, I mean, this is actually going to drive public health decisions in the
Yeah.
South around whether or not these teams are going to play and who's going to be in the stadium.
Well, and there's an identity that's driven through this, right? Um, good, bad, whatever you want to call it, and there's good and bad to both sides of it, to a certain extent. It's but we grew up in an era of of towns being defined by their football programs, right? Um, you know, Friday Night Lights, which is a fictional TV series, started off as a nonfiction book about the Odessa Permian Panthers.
Yeah.
The games that are described in that book are games that I attended,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
And I know all of those characters, as well as there's been a documentary that's come out recently about the Carter Cowboys in South Dallas and them getting their state title taken away and things like that. And that these communities, even while a lot of the way things are portrayed is that they're these small towns that's the only thing that's going on. Well, Carter's an inner city school in
Yeah.
South Dallas, right? South Oak Cliff. We're going to go off on the football tangent for a second.
Let's do it.
South Oak Cliff just won their state championship in 4A. And, South Oak Cliff hasn't ever won a state championship. And South Oak Cliff, not a decade ago, was almost disbanded because of lack of performance at an academic level. And those things have all been turned around at numerous levels, and some of that gets driven by athletics and not always in a bad way.
Hmm.
It draws attention to a school, and then they're like, hey, this school's the state champions. Look at the disrepair that's infrastructure of this school. Look at what these kids are doing despite their environment. We should be helping them out. We should be doing more. And it draws attention to that. And it's
Yeah.
true, and it goes the other way.
Sure.
There there are high schools in Texas that get investigated for, you know, shipping players in and paying for their homes to play high school football for them. That
I
has
think
happened as well. You know.
I yeah, I think this is one of the layers that's just it's really important. It's around sport, it could be around church,
Mhm.
but it's a way of understanding the pandemic at a culturally specific level. I'm not trying to get fancy on you, but I
Oh,
just
no,
say-
no.
I think if
You
you
just may have to explain it to me.
as I have as I have felt a lot of I think rage is fair. I've got
Sure.
family working in the public schools. I've got family who have, you know, who may be medically vulnerable. Um, Not all of them have followed best health practices.
Mhm.
Some of them have refused to be vaccinated. It's been hard for me to deal with
Sure.
that. But I keep coming back to, and so you try to reduce it. It's like, well, you either have correct behavior or incorrect behavior in terms of protection against COVID. But if you don't factor some of these other things in,
Mhm.
and there's many other things to factor in, which we'll talk about in terms of misinformation and
Sure.
forces who are actively working to misguide people, you will not ever be able to understand those numbers. You'll never be able to understand why so many people have chosen not to be vaccinated, or who insisted that football keep going, or that church
Yeah.
services meet in person.
Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned church. I have family members that I think that the closing of churches drove that narrative for them. The narrative of, no mask, of the government mandating that, that they can't worship God. And that's a very powerful thing, an idea to work against. I mean, those are some things that are very important to folks here, you know, and that if you're telling me that I can't go to church, then you're literally severing parts of my soul away from me. And when you start putting it like that, people are like, "Oh, I didn't think about it that way because I don't go to church," or whatever it is, right? And I mean, even people who can look at the science
Yeah.
and see what's being said and see what's not being said, But because it becomes emotional at that point in time, it's not about the facts. That's what it boils down to. It's about
Yeah.
limiting my ability to live my life the way I want to live my life.
What were those discussions like in your family? I mean, my parents are divorced, both remarried, so I kind of have two families with
Yep.
lots of brothers and sisters on both sides, and it's
Yep.
kind of an interesting contrast. On one side, everybody has followed every public health rule, and on the other side, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And honestly, early on, there were some suggestions to me to check out ivermectin and other things, and I didn't go further with that discussion with that side of my family because I knew
Sure.
I knew they weren't going to get vaccinated, and they got COVID. They've recovered, but I mean, Russ,
Yeah.
dude, it's been hard, man. I mean,
Yeah.
I get so
No.
angry about
Yeah.
this.
And that's something I've been working on as well, because I definitely get worked up and angry. This last week and a half, with the transgender executive order that came out and all that here in Texas, that hits real close to home for me, and I am, pretty furious about it. Um, but I'm also trying to get to where we combat it with facts. We combat it with their own rhetoric, right? If you think masks are government control, why is the state government stepping in and telling me what the best medical procedures are for my children, when I am consulting with a medical professional?
Sure.
And the fact of the matter is that, you know, in in 2 years or whatever, we're also like making laws and deciding to criminalize something that doesn't exist, and you know that's going to eat up resources, number one, and monetary resources, and number two, the Texas Family Protective Services system for decades has been notoriously rife with sexual assault cases and sexual abuse cases in the foster care system,
Right.
and we're going to take money away from investigating that to investigating families that are actually trying to get care. And the fact of the matter is, we already have laws that address medical malpractice in cases that where the wrong medical decision was made for a child. We already have laws in place. We don't need to isolate a single community, um, because they don't match up with our ideas of what we think people should be. That's not what America was based on. That's not what the Constitution was based on. And I get real tired of being preached at about Constitution and original intent and freedom and all of that, and that masks are about government control
Yeah.
and vaccines are about government control. And then when I turn around, you know, oh, we're doing it to protect the kids. It's like, you don't care about the kids. If you
You
cared
know,
about the kids,
yeah.
you would be actually doing things to help children and not trying to actively isolate certain communities, and also like looking at how we treat children in poverty. We don't care about that. We only care about the things that allow us to own the libs to a certain extent.
I mean, it's
But I'm
something I
Yeah.
hadn't thought about it quite this way till you were talking about it. I'm putting something together here, which is that it's not just pressures. So let's talk about the South. We're talking about Texas. We're
Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
places where there might be pretty wide varieties in one family of approaches to COVID.
Yep.
That's not the first time any of these families, certainly not the first time in my family, we disagree about things.
Hmm.
Um, but you're talking also about the role of the state actually
Yeah.
increasing the pressure on family. So it's
Right.
like let's throw one more thing on top. You thought that it
Sure.
was enough to argue about vaccines and masks and whether or not you should play football or go back to school in the middle of a pandemic. Let's also talk about an issue, as you said, which doesn't affect most families, but we'd like you to argue
Hardly
about it
any.
anyway.
Yeah.
But let's have you
Hardly
argue
any.
about transfers. I mean, that's the again, that's what just sticks in my craw, this idea of a sort of limited government rhetoric in Texas, when the government is constantly creating stress on the family unit at the time when the family needs to read. You can disagree in a family and still support one another.
Right. And that's correct. And that's the key. And the state doesn't need to get involved in that.
No, it doesn't.
Um, and I'm talking about not all just the state of Texas, but I'm just talking about big state.
Yeah, sure.
Because I do agree with certain limited government ideas. It's just that where I want limited government and where they want limited government are completely different things, right?
Yeah.
It's like I believe in personal freedom, and the challenge that I was before I got you got me worked up. I know it wasn't your fault; it was me. But where I've been trying to redirect that anger is through education, but also really challenging myself to be empathetic to why this rhetoric is developing in the first place, right? Um, Many of our family members, due to the media, the media echo chambers they're in, due to um, some of the media echo chambers they're not in and that they're railing against, feel under attack. And it's like, why do
Mm.
you feel under attack? And it's that conversation about, well, what's really happening, is that, you know, they have been operating from the scarcity mindset for so long that they think somehow that if transphobic or not transphobic, if transgendered children have rights that they have, or gay people have rights that they have, or anyone, that somehow that's going to take away their rights, when they don't really spin it and look at it as, if everybody has the same rights
Right.
and nobody feels minimalized or marginalized, then we all win. And there isn't a scarcity of natural human rights, right? There's only this idea that we have to move forward to where if everybody gets the same level of respect, which they're not. And the ironic thing about it is to me, a lot of these movements, over the past, well, through the pandemic as well, is a lot of these conservative Christian right wing thinkers and talkers are finally being treated like the minorities that are finally getting a voice.
Mm.
And what they realize is that sucks. But they think that the only way that they can respond against that is by making sure that we,
Yeah.
restrict voting rights, that we make sure
Yeah.
that we marginalize them further so that they feel like they can't talk anymore. If
Yeah.
we shout them down, they're not. And so my goal is to not shout
Yeah.
people back down, but actually have the conversation of, hey, let's talk about it. And if we can't talk about it, you know, putting it in the family dynamic, it's like, I'm never not going to love you, brother. It's not going to happen. We may not be able to talk to one another,
Yeah. Yeah. I've got
but the
that.
love
I've
is
got that with.
always good. Whenever
Yeah.
you want to come back around to talk, I am here.
I've got that with one of mine right now. Let me
Yeah,
just remind
and
folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Russ Farr today about family, work, and life in Texas in the middle of a pandemic. Another way to say that is I'm talking to one of my dearest, oldest friends on COVID Calls today, which is a delight for me. And I want to shift over a little bit, Russ. I want to talk
sure,
about your experience of work in this pandemic because uh, the economy has been disrupted multiple times.
sure.
And if people look at the macro economy, or you look at the Dow, I was talking about this yesterday with Ksenia Chamutina about this. Like, yeah, from a neoliberal perspective, to say, hey, looks like the economy is pandemic proof.
Right.
But when you talk to real people, you know that is not the story. What's your experience been?
So economically, well, I mean, you know, back pandemic kicked off. I was working for a startup doing fresh, healthy takeout. they managed to, while they reduced footprint on retail and then started trying to expand direct to consumer, they managed to hang on to me about 6 months, and then they had to let me go. So, for 6 months of the pandemic, I was out of work, and so I was unemployed, and then went through the expanded unemployment benefits, and then went through the not expanded unemployment benefits, and then went through out of unemployment benefits, and
Mm.
so that was all challenging, right? Um, and it's you know, luckily enough, I ran out of unemployment at the same time I got another job. So and then I bounced through a couple of jobs until I landed at the one I'm in now, which was actually the target the entire time. Um,
Why did the
and
company have to let you go early in the pandemic? You made it 6 months in, but what was the story with them? I mean, they just literally couldn't that people were not shopping, people were not buying their product, or they used it as an opportunity to do some restructure? Like, what's the story?
all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a combination of all those factors. I had been with the company for 5.5 years. I started off as like a distribution manager and delivery manager for the Dallas market, expanded that market from 6 stores to I think 24 at one point in time. Then we centralized the whole thing. I created a hub and spoke distribution system for all of Texas,
Yeah.
went up to like 48, took over Whole Foods, did all that. Well, when we started pulling everything back, I was getting paid for, a guy who's managing a 3 market hub and spoke system across 100 stores. It's and now we have 10 stores
Yeah.
and are trying to make a direct to consumer shift on the fly to a direct to consumer model and make it profitable. Well, guess what you don't need is a guy who's a multi-market manager who
Yeah.
can do what I did, and the fact that they held on to me for 6 months as opposed to like April letting me go. um
I
and
think
they
people
even like reduced
peop
my salary in April, gave it
yeah.
back to me, and then laid me off.
It's really interesting because I mean, I think is I'm sorry you had to go through that, and
No,
but people can tell from this conversation, like you're a real you're a real face to face guy. You're good on the phone too, but like you're not the person you want to put in charge of some like delivery distribution, internet based kind of fulfillment service. Like you really
right.
shine when it comes to working face to face with people and growing that market and working with people who have to get the job done. I mean, that's your real it's your superpower, man. And so
Appreciate it.
I think that's your skills were not made for that inflection point of the
Hmm.
sort of like we're going to move everything now up online and get it to people at their home and never speak to them. All right, that's not a RUSS PHARR model, I don't think.
Yeah, and it was also just trying to streamline and reduce production costs and all that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah,
So yeah, and I mean, not that, I mean, my role wasn't exactly a public facing role, but at um that breadth, it was a lot. It was managing a lot of people,
right.
quite, and not just managing all my direct reports, but also I would have, at one point in time we had 45 plus stores, so I had 45 general managers that are
Yeah,
also coming to me with whatever issues that they had for that day. So and so we were working through that as well. So it was a lot of people management type stuff. And then as that reduced, um, my skill set didn't my skill set and not my, I won't say my financial needs, but my skill set and what my expectations were after 5.5 years with the company, those weren't ever gonna realign. It just wasn't gonna happen. And I had gotten fairly burned out. I mean, we had made
yeah,
pivot after pivot after pivot, and
yeah.
to a
Startup
certain
is
extent, I
hard.
got one raise in 5.5 years, and it was an awesome raise, by the way. I'll give full credit, but it was.
How did you land?
Uh, so I um had to make some pivots and some hard choices based off of what I needed, to do I had some opportunities. We had a third-party distribution company that was going to offer me that would give me a position, basically transition to do my same job over there for them. Um, it wasn't something that I was burned out at the time. I didn't want to particularly move to. And so I didn't. And that was pretty challenging because for about the first month and a half, I had some real kind of opportunities. And then for for the next like 5.5 months, my resume is real weird. It's real hard for someone to look at it through an online, you know, hiring system and go, "Oh, I know how to use this guy." Um, and it's in the middle of the pandemic, and like you kind of said, I'm a people person. You don't really get what I am until you like meet me, talk to me, and like get to know me a little bit. And so, it was a real challenge. It was like I probably put out, I applied for hundreds of jobs, right? And it was, I did a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. I did a lot of stuff of reaching out to people. The company that I am working for now, I discovered back in 2018, and loved what they were doing and the ideas behind it. But they weren't based anywhere really in Texas. And then when they started hiring in Texas, I started applying for that job and got an interview. Didn't get chosen. Actually, like that particular job got pushed back, and then I didn't get kind of called back. Got pushed back months, not like, and I didn't get a call back on that. So I just kept on applying, and then I like went in and networked on LinkedIn and kind of with people who worked for this company and looked at what they did and said, okay. So a lot of them have previous automotive. A lot of them have, this. A lot of them worked for a competitor. And I said, okay, so I need some automotive experience, need some environmental experience. So the next job that became available to me that I got hired was traditional automotive sales, which I did for about 6 to 8 weeks. Absolutely did not like it.
Yeah.
While I'm a people person, I am not an
That's high
automotive.
stress.
I'm not a car salesman,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is fine. I mean, I worked with some really freaking awesome people who are car salesmen, and they were really, really good at it, and I am not. and they are awesome, right? And then I had gotten a call back from another job that was doing solar. So I was in the environmental space again, and I took that job. Jumped to that job, and then finally got started getting callbacks from the company that I'm at now, and kind of lined it all up. And I was like, well, what did it for you guys? Well, notice you had some previous automotive experience. I like your logistical background, and
Yeah.
the fact that you're working in solar didn't hurt at all. We're an environmental company, so I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So I just lined it all up and made sure that that's what you had to do. And I had a plan, but it wasn't always going to be it wasn't always going to work out. I kind of I like when I took the car salesman job, it was like, okay, cool, I'm selling cars. That's what I do, and I'm gonna dive in. Um, and then same thing with solar. Solar was real up my. It was uh installation coordination, so it was like making sure I talked to the customers. Customers knew what the crews were going to need. The crews knew what I need. Crews knew what to tell me what they needed. I knew how to get everybody lined up. That's what I used to do for years as a stagehand, as a job lead, and as a stagehand. So that was up my alley. I really liked that job, but this was the company that I always wanted to work for.
So for people who are just tuning in, I'm talking to RUSS PHARR on COVID calls, and we're talking about life and work in the middle of this pandemic. And so in the last, if I got this right, in the last 36 months, you've worked in food preparation, management, and distribution. You've worked in auto sales. You've worked in solar, and now you landed with Rivian. And I have thought about that in a couple different ways. I've had a lot of
and I was
calls.
unemployed. Let's not forget that
And
the
the
hardest
period of
job that I
unemployment.
had was unemployed.
Right. Well, also you're a dad.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's other non-compensated work that people know about in the middle of this pandemic and what that's meant in helping teenagers particularly cope with distance learning and things like that. So I don't want to leave that out. But
Yep.
this has been an environmental. I think this pandemic has, in different ways, sometimes surprising ways, brought environmental issues of climate change to the fore. And now we're in the midst of watching this atrocity in Ukraine. And, we hear this constantly reported, and I think it's more or less true. I mean, the only thing Russia has to offer to the world economically is oil and gas.
Yep.
And so, you're working for a company that's disrupting that system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the goal. And I think, one of the things that I like working for Rivian, and we're kind of in the new, if you follow EV companies, we're in the news. We had some things drop this week, but I won't go into those. But the thing I love about working for Rivian is that it's the first company that I've worked for that is attacking not only environmental change in a responsible way, but also in, I spoke briefly about scarcity mindset a little bit earlier too. It's this idea, like, we look at the media and we fall into these like media maelstroms about stuff, right? I was thinking about it today. This is out there, but I mean, you picked a heck of a week to talk to me. I feel like I'm in a starry night with all the swirls. It's like I'm in this one, I'm in this one, I'm in this one now, and I'm just getting passed from one to the other, and it's been challenging. And but we get into this scarcity mindset. Like, one of the things we get talked about a lot is, oh, Rivian's challenging to be the next Tesla. And it's like, no, we don't really want to be the next Tesla. We want Tesla to be Tesla. We want Rivian to be Rivian. And there's 1 billion cars on the roads in the world today, and they're all speeding us towards, not speeding it. The climate disaster, you and I have already talked about this, and you talk about this a lot, is already going on.
Yeah.
There's no going towards it. It's here. We're how, and some people talk about it as, the world is going to, the world's fine. The planet's going to be just fine. If you need any indication of how the planet's going to be, go back to the first 6 weeks of the pandemic when nobody was driving, and think about how clear the skies were.
Yeah.
That's what you need to know. And that's what we have to work towards. The planet's going to heal itself just fine. It's just whether it decides to do it with us on it or not. That's the key. And we have some control over whether we get to stick around or not. Sure. And so it's not going to take one company to corner the market, right? It's going to take all the companies to corner the market. The more the Chevys, GMs, the more the GMs, the Fords, the Stellantis get involved in this, the Japanese makers and the Chinese makers get involved in this, the quicker we get to a place where we can actually make some progress with the climate change. And the thing that really, really decided that for me was when, Ford, GM, and the major automakers, while Trump was in office, said we will be all electric by 2040. They're not making that decision because they think the electric car is the best thing for the environment. They're making that decision because it makes sense monetarily.
Sure.
And it's important to think that way. And, and it's important to think about things holistically and like, with an abundance mindset, as opposed to a scarcity mindset. We can't possibly make all the electric cars in the world. There's no company that can do that. We should all be working together to figure out a way to make that happen. Right. It's challenging in a market economy because people want to corner the market and they want to be the best and they want to, or what I won't go too far down that rabbit hole, but it's like, best is relative. They want to be the most profitable. They really don't care about being the best. Most large market companies do not care about that. But if we can make climate change in the sense of kind of pulling us back from this precipice, a market-driven thing, we're not getting out of the market economy anytime soon to where everybody lives, the Star Trek utopia where you all have replicators
Yeah.
and everybody has what they need, right? It's just not. It's not going to happen for another 5 centuries, apparently. Um, but it's that idea of once it becomes the thing to do, that's when we can make these
Yeah.
changes, and it's creating products and mindsets and educating people on what is possible and focusing on the optimism and the positivity of the things as opposed to looking at all the negative things. There's plenty of negative, and we focus so much on it, and it's hard. It's
Yeah.
exhausting. It's exhausting to fight the negativity with the positivity. I had a bit of a I went down a media rabbit hole earlier today where it was just like all bad news.
Yeah.
And I was I was like, I literally thought of this conversation and went, "Ugh, I don't know if I could do this." But
Yeah. Well,
I could pull it out. I could pull it out. I'm good.
well, that's why friendship is good, right? You get what
Right.
you get what you need. We can go negative or we can go positive. Life is
Right.
complicated, and we can talk about what we need to. I'm proud of you for taking this job. I'm proud of you for surviving this. I mean,
Well, yeah.
and I think it's also like you're just a great spokesperson. Everything that whole riff you were just on is a way to answer the IPCC report that just came out, but it's in a way that it's sort of talking about intergenerational issues. It's talking about you talk about the sort of moving from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, and then also just like common sense around
Yeah.
economic transition, which will have enormous geopolitical impacts. I want to just be cognizant of time. We're going to
Yep.
wrap up here in a couple of minutes, but all right. So picture, if you will,
Right.
let's say sometime in 1991, James McMurtry, Robert L. Keane Jr., Boy Dog Pondering. That's one you hadn't thought
Yep.
about in a while. Blues Traveler. We're driving in your pickup truck. All right, so we did, Texas. I know that's a cliche, but there we were, and that music has been sustaining to me. A lot of that music, even to now. You and I have always
Sure.
talked about music, in,
Absolutely.
and often in the hardest times of our lives,
Yeah.
that we will talk about what's going on in our lives, but then we're talking about music. So I guess my question is, what have you been listening to?
So, a couple folks uh in the last 6 months that I've discovered um have in a lot of ways saved me from my own, abyss, I guess you could say, of my own mind by actually voicing things that I think about. And these are dark, dark songs, a lot of them, some of them. And, but it's that idea that, oh, there's another person out there, right? And there's a person who says it better than I can ever describe it. Um, and one of those guys is a guy here from East Dallas. He just released his third album. His name's Joshua Ray Walker, and I'm like, I pester you constantly. Go listen to this. Go listen to this now. And he's just got a way about his songwriting. Is the song that hooked me was a song called Voices, which is a song about suicide. And one of the opening lines is I stare at my reflection at the bottles behind the bar. And not to go too deep, but we've been in certain places in our lives where that rings, whether it was an actual physical manifestation, that definitely rings true, to where we were in our mindset, right? And the fact that somebody could say it so elegantly and so clearly, you're like, oh my God, that's fantastic. Um, and he has I can't remember that song's Voices. He's got 3 albums out, and they're not all this dark. And I'm not this dark either. It's just that idea of having knowing that there are other people out there that are facing their demons as well as you are, and that your demons uh, are close to you, but you're also realize that everybody else is facing those down as well, right? He has another song off, I think, off the first album, and I can't remember the name of it, but one of the first lines is, I laid in bed for an hour just to make sure that God didn't make a mistake and forgot to take me in my sleep. It's just that kind of powerful name. You're like, what?
Yeah.
Who says that? But and then the other person that I'm listening to a lot of Americana. Over the last 2 years, Jason Isbell, lifesaver.
If I could only
And
get Jason Isbell to come on COVID calls and talk about writing songs during this pandemic.
right. And then
Yeah.
all the, I haven't been listening as much of my Texas guys. McMurtry.
He's not speaking to you right now?
He's not. I haven't listened to it, and it's
You know
not.
what?
It's
I
not
went
coming.
back to
It's not coming through. Yeah.
I went back to that song. You know that song? It's actually a Kinky Friedman song, but you know the Wild Man from Borneo?
Yeah.
That song. I'm the wild
No
man from
man from Borneo.
Borneo.
Yeah.
You come to
Well,
see what you want to see, but you come to see, but you never come to know. At various moments in the pandemic, that song has come back to me. I love that song.
yeah. It's and I think some of the music from that time that calls back to those things, um, that comes back to those ideas. You know, Robert Robert O'Keen, James McMurtry takes me to a very visceral place in my memory, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so the new stuff, when I try and listen to the things, I don't have a memory that anchors me to that music, if that
Mm-hmm.
makes sense.
No, it totally makes
Where
sense.
where we've just grown, we're not divergent, and we're have the same roots, and I love the music, but it's also like it doesn't. I'm in a different place, and it doesn't anchor to what I'm doing now, or
Yeah.
what I'm thinking now. And I'm actually like working diligently. Like if you send me music, I'm like, listen to that for a little while, because you've got to get out of these
Yeah.
ruts you're in. And
I hear
so,
some of that, but I hear some of that old music with new ears too.
yeah.
I went back to
Oh,
I went back to Redheaded Stranger 2 weeks
oh
ago,
yeah.
and I heard
So
that music differently.
yeah. So yeah, go back to Redheaded Stranger. Here's one for you. Go to Redheaded Stranger and listen to Redheaded Stranger, and then listen to Sturgill Simpson's Ballad of uh is it Benny and June? No, not that's the movie. I can't remember. It's June and or Juanita and
That's
hold
right.
on.
Everybody's got the internet. They'll figure it out.
Yeah, find it. Find Sturgill Simpson as his most recent
Yeah,
album,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
he wrote a concept album along the lines of Redheaded Stranger, inspired by the Redheaded Stranger, but nothing like other than the music. And it's fantastic. Sturgill's been fantastic. Morgan Wade, she's got an album out called Wilder Days. I've been playing the crap out of that. It ended up being Rolling Stone's best, like #1 new country album of the year, and Joshua's most recent album was like the #6 one. I felt kind of vindicated that I had chosen decent music at that point in time, no matter how you feel about Rolling Stone. But
yeah. Well, we should wrap up. The other thing
yeah,
that just a couple other notes on music that I have taken a lot of comfort from Joni Mitchell, as I always do.
yeah.
And even Phoebe Bridgers, who I never listened to before, and Sufjan Stevens, and writers who writers who are really good about writing about illness and
Okay, yeah,
loss, but also who had the skills to write the music, which can sometimes tell a sympathetic story. I mean, Sufjan Stevens is genius at that. I mean, you've got the words, but then there's something else happening
that's
behind the
going on there.
scenes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found a lot of solace in that music in this time, and maybe more than any, Aretha Franklin.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Yeah, I've been taking little bit deeper dive back into like Aretha and then Sam and Dave
Oh
and
yeah,
some of the older R&B stuff, and that was inspired by like Leon Bridges and Black
yeah,
Pumas.
sure.
It's like, there's another guy you should check out that I didn't share with you yet. His name's Charlie Crockett. He's another Texas singer songwriter,
I heard
and
about it. I
his
haven't
stuff.
listened to it yet.
Okay, so he does a cover of Big Iron. You know that
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Roger Miller song, Big
Yeah,
Iron on Your Hip kind of thing.
yeah,
But all of his music is phenomenal. Like it like his original stuff sounds like a Roger Miller or a Slim Whitman or from that like kind of Route 66.
yeah, sure.
And it's fantastic.
I'll check that out. You and my
Yeah.
brother Dave have both told me this now, so now I have to do it because
Oh yeah. Has he been telling you about Charlie Crockett? Yeah,
yeah,
fantastic. Yeah, you got to you'll absolutely dig it. I was listening to it on KXT on
cool.
the local alternative
All
adult
right,
accused AAA whatever. And the first
we
time I heard him, I was like, "Oh my god, they're playing this song!" And then I realized that's not that song. That's a new guy.
we
So,
better wrap up.
yes, sir.
This could go on another hour in this
Sure.
way. But
Yeah.
I just want to remind folks you've been listening to COVID calls, and you can usually catch COVID calls at 7 p.m. Eastern time weekdays. Although these days you can catch COVID calls around the clock. And I just want to thank my friend Russ Farr for making time to talk on COVID calls. And your friendship means a lot to me. This conversation means a lot to me. It's good to see you doing well. I love you, and thanks for being on.
Hey, man, I love you too. One last thing, I want you to know. Don't be embarrassed by this, but I'm super proud of you for doing this. I don't know how you do it. It's I don't get to listen as much as I'd like, and it's
That's right.
been
It's all
really, really good.
archived. You just make some
I know.
time. Just
I
make
just
some
go
time.
go back and look, and so I just really appreciate you. I'm really proud of you for doing this. Um, yeah, it's just been phenomenal. So keep up the good work.
Thanks for that, buddy. Take care, everybody. We'll talk
Absolutely,
to you next time on COVID calls.
absolutely.